The Samsung S61A is an all-in-one 5-channel soundbar, and in this review you can see if it's actually worth its price tag, because in the UK it can be found for roughly £280, and shout out to box.co.uk for actually providing me this sample, and in the US it can be found for roughly $230. So to kick off this review, I do want to talk about its aesthetics, and I know this is quite subjective, but I quite like it. It is very much branded as a lifestyle speaker by Samsung, and you can see why. It's got a fabric mesh that stems towards the top and around the back of the soundbar, and towards the side you've still got this quite stylish look with a kind of oval shaped finish to it. Frankly, I think it will fit in most sorts of living room setups, and of course it's available both in black and a white finish as well. Now, in order to interact with the soundbar, there's some physical buttons found at the top of it, and this makes it quite convenient in case you lose your remote. But it should be noted that unlike the other soundbars that I've previously reviewed, whereby you've got an LCD LED indicator which shows you the settings and the levels that you're adjusting, the S61A does not have it. Instead, it has a small LED indicator which goes up or down depending on, let's say, you're adjusting the volume or the bass levels. There is also an audible cue from a female voice which tells you bass or treble while you are going through the different settings via the remote, but still I would have actually quite liked to see an actual display which gave me the indication of what I am adjusting. Now, of course, you do have a bundled remote which gives you a few extra functionalities and also allows you to adjust the volume or, for example, certain settings from afar. So moving on, we get onto the app, and if you tap it over here you can change in terms of the inputs, which is pretty good to see. And then you've got the volume adjustment, the sound modes where you've got standard, music, which needs to be capitalized by the way, and adaptive sound. And then you have got the equalizer whereby you've got bass and treble functions. In my case I've added one notch to the treble EQ because I just thought that resulted in a better sort of sound. And as for the advanced sound settings, here you've got night mode and voice enhancement, whereby the first one can be enabled via the remote, although night mode cannot be enabled via the remote, so therefore you'll need to resort to the app, which I just find a little bit baffling. Likewise over here, if you go on the device settings, you've got the channel volume. Now the side level can be adjusted via the remote as well, although the center channel can only be adjusted via the remote, but not via the app. And yet here you do have a rear level, which I can only imagine is based on the rear speakers if you were to purchase them as additional option, so it's pretty much redundant if you do not have that. I just find that somewhat baffling, and it's been a complaint that I've progressively had with Samsung soundbar devices. You do have the audio sync, which you can adjust, your Bluetooth pairing mode, and check your network status, and the audio feedback, which you can change in terms of language. Elsewhere, if you go at the top right over here, you've got the Alexa and Spotify settings, and you can update your firmware or check for the latest firmware by going on the information tab. Now, of course, to connect up to the app, the soundbar does support Wi-Fi, and therefore it does have certain features also built in. And I did allude to these quite briefly, but you do have Spotify Connect and also Amazon Alexa, whereby the latter is supported natively and it actually has it completely baked in. So therefore you can provide certain commands via your voice only. Of course, if you don't want this, you'll just not want to set up Alexa altogether, and or you can press the mic mute button that's found towards the top of the soundbar. Aside from this, you do have Apple AirPlay 2, which is great. However, it's slightly a shame and somewhat weird to see Google Chromecast not supported. I say weird because Samsung is in the Android market, not in the iOS market, so it's slightly weird and baffling not to see one supported while the other is. Nonetheless, if you do want to connect over wirelessly and you've got an Android smartphone, you can also use Bluetooth, whereby the SPC codec is supported only. Therefore, I'd only resort to using this as a very last way of connecting up to the soundbar, purely because the SPC codec isn't going to give you the best sort of sonic reproduction. So moving swiftly on, I should talk about the wired connectivity options, and here it's pretty limited because you've got only a singular optical input and a singular HDMI ARC output. It would have been great to see Samsung actually integrate a HDMI input as well for those people that have a set-top box or something like that, which would have made this soundbar a little bit more versatile. So with all of that in mind, let's get onto a sound demo. First off, I'll be going on to a music one, whereby I'll be using Priya J's track, which is called Falling, and then I'll be going to a piece to camera, where I'll be presenting the Polestar 2 on Totally EV. Links to these videos can be found down in the description below in case you're interested.
not quite sussed it yet. When I reach the brink, don't stop to think. I always sink, and now I am crawling my way back to falling from so high, falling from so high.
Music.
The thing is, my imagination is constantly racing 1,000 miles ahead.
Adaptive sound.
But it's floating, I'm always hoping. When I reach the brink, don't stop to think. I always sink, and now
More specifically, we've got the long-range model that starts from roughly £45,000. If you don't need the bigger battery pack, it'll cost around £42,000. So how does it compare to its rivals and indeed its all-wheel drive sibling? Let's find out. Now I appreciate a sound demo over YouTube is never ideal, so let's get on to my subjective opinion. And first off, in terms of the sub-bass extension, it's no surprise that this all-in-one soundbar, given that it's subwoofer-less, doesn't really extend in the lower echelons of the bass frequency tones. Now of course you can add a subwoofer unit to it, and you can also add rear speakers, which is just great in terms of upgradability over the years, for example, whereby you might be saving up for that upgrade. But the review that I'm doing is of just a soundbar unit, and as such I will just say that the sub-bass response is pretty much cut short. Now as for the mid-bass, it's actually pretty punchy and hearty. It's quite surprising, to be quite honest with you, because you'd expect it to be quite weak, but you do hear quite a little bit of oomph. Of course it won't compare with more Bassier or those soundbar units that do have a dedicated subwoofer, including when it comes to the mid-bass response, but still here the Samsung S61A does a pretty impressive job when it comes to this frequency range. It's pretty precise and just keeps you excited when you're listening back to your favorite tracks. Now as for the mid-range, here I would say it's one of its biggest selling points, and I think here it's where the market will be for the S61A. Same sort of comments I had about one of its predecessors. Now here the soundbar does an excellent job of producing really good mid-range response, specifically when you're listening to vocals. That's why I had the piece de camera on me presenting the Polestar 2 on Totally EV, because it gives you an indication of how good and how competent it is at producing very accurate and very forward sounding vocals. Now you do have the active voice amplifier feature that you can enable or disable, which you might have heard slight differences, but when you do enable it, and for example you're listening to music or something that has a lot of other background noise, then it will really hone into the mid-range and therefore the vocals and amplify it. So it does exactly what it says on the tin, and I appreciate my demo might have not really given you that sort of accurate reproduction, but what I'll say is that when I was just looking at regular YouTube videos or terrestrial TV, I did notice a difference. Of course this does impact the lows and the highs and the overall soundstage, but where it comes to the vocals, it does even boost it even more to the foreground. Ultimately, that function is there for you to use if you're going to be wanting that extra boost in the mids. Now, as for the highs, they extend relatively well. You do feel it's a little bit rolled off at the top end, but it will still give you that sort of toe-tapping feeling and keep you excited when you're listening to tracks or, for example, watching movies. Now, with that in mind, we should go on to a movie demo. Here we are using Age of Extinctions, which is Transformers, of course, and be cycling through the different modes as well. So do check out the annotations down in the description below, so whereby you can understand how the soundbar is actually running. So hopefully you were able to hear the differences between Dolby Digital and PCM, and I can definitely say while listening to it in person there's a massive contrast. Of course here you don't have to be listening or watching to a 4K Blu-ray player. You can also enjoy the better metadata of Dolby Digital by watching regular terrestrial HD television in comparison to SD television, and this will just give you a much better experience, at least in my opinion. Now this also does bring me on to its soundstage, and here the overall width and depth is somewhat closed. The soundbar can't compete with longer soundbars out there on the market, which will just give you a little bit more of extra spaciousness. Despite you having the ability to adjust the side channels or even the center channel independently, I do feel while doing that too much will result to a little bit of an artificial reproduction. Here you can see my settings that I shared before on the app section within this review. Now as for the instrument separation, it's pretty good. I had no problems whatsoever, and that's thanks to the fact that the soundbar does have a 5-channel 7-driver configuration, which is really impressive for a compact soundbar. Ultimately, the Soundstage has its pros and cons, but given the size of the soundbar, I think you should keep your expectations in check. Now with all of that in mind, how do I rate the Samsung S61A? Well, quite frankly, after my review of its predecessor, I was left very impressed. That extra center channel does give you a little bit of a better reproduction in the mid-range department and further amplifies that voice function that you have that you can enable or disable. I think it's a great alternative to its predecessor and just improves on certain domains. It can be found for around £280, as I mentioned before, on box.co.uk, and for this price I can't think of a better all-in-one soundbar that focuses on the mid-range, and as such it actually gets my Best Buy awards. Now there are of course other alternatives that you might want to consider, and they'll be down in the description below for your consideration. If you've got any comments or thoughts about the soundbar, do let me know down below as well. Now if you've liked this independent detailed review and want to see more from myself, definitely do drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which are greatly appreciated. And if you've done that already, I just want to thank you in advance. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.